So this is way back in the 80s, when we didn't have dashboard GPS or Google Maps or whatever to help us out on the road. All we had was our trusty old coffee-stained road maps to guide us on our way. But before y'all start thinking that this is me reminiscing about happier, simpler times, don't get it twisted. I wouldn't turn back the clock for $1,000,000. Because if I'd had GPS back when I was a young man, I mightn't have gotten into half the trouble I did while driving. I have 2 incidents to talk about today, and the first one occurred south of the border, down in Mexico. I was making the 40-mile drive from Morelia to Ciudad Hidalgo, and back in those days, there were only 2 routes you could take. One was the National Road, which wasn't all that bad, but then there was the Old National Road, which was, I'm pretty sure, designed by an actual sadist. It's a hilly highway known to the locals as Mil Cumbres, meaning 1,000 curves. And for a good reason, too. That thing is like riding a roller coaster in sections, and I've heard of other drivers getting actual motion sickness when they've attempted to traverse it. But ironically, as horrible as it is to drive, it has some of the best views of any drive you're ever likely to experience. And if you take it real slow and careful, it can actually be quite pleasant. My grandpa in particular used to love driving up there. People said he was loco, and he probably kinda was, but he was right about Mil Cumbres. Sometimes the rewards really did outweigh the risks. So on this one particular day, me and my grandfather drive up on the Mil Cumbres, and we're just cruising while we watch the sun go down over Michoacan. When it was full dark, Grandpa decided to take one last run along the highway before we returned home. I'm looking out the window, marveling at the stars in the sky, like, it's amazing how much clearer you can see the stars down there, and it was always one of my favorite things to do whenever I went to Mexico as a kid. I was just lost in how vast the universe seemed when, suddenly, Grandpa slams on the brakes of the car so hard I violently lurched forward in my seat. I thought we'd only narrowly avoided an accident or something, but when I looked out into the road ahead of us, there was no other cars to be seen. I asked my grandpa what was going on, thinking it might have been a false alarm or something, but he looks seriously freaked out as he starts backing up and turning us around. There's my giant, tough-as-nails abuelo, and he's terrified by something, so naturally, I start freaking out too. I turn in my seat as he turns the car, trying to get a glimpse of whatever he's obviously fleeing from, but still, there's nothing in the road. Yet as we're speeding away, I see something move out of the trees at the side of the road. It was only a silhouette, but it was obvious it was a person, and they were carrying something long and heavy, something I only later realized was a gun. I found out years later that bandidos used to operate on those roads. They usually only targeted cargo trucks or the flashier cars of businessmen driving to and from Ciudad, Mexico. But when my abuelo saw those dudes just walking out of the trees towards us, he didn't want to take any chances. Definitely the scariest story from when I was a kid, but I think it was rooted in seeing how scared my abuelo was. On the other hand, I have a story from my 30s that happened when I was driving alone, and I didn't need any sense of childish wonder to get the complete life scared out of me. This isn't nearly as long as the Mexico story, but as you'll see, it doesn't need to be. I'm driving over to my parents' place in rural Illinois, and this is a drive I've made countless times before, so I'm completely on autopilot. So when I catch the glimpse of a deer in my peripheral vision, I slam on the brakes, trying to avoid plowing into this thing while doing 60. My heart is pounding while I'm just sitting there waiting for the thing to run out into the road. Only nothing shows. Now, since the light in my car happened to be busted, I kept a small flashlight and a map on the passenger seat next to me. So, wondering where the deer disappeared to, I grab the flashlight and start shining it out into the trees at the side of the road. After a second, I see the deer's eyes reflecting some of my flashlight back at me, so I know it's still there just staring at me. Only when I actually light the thing up, I see it's not a deer at all. It's just a deer's head, staked into the dirt facing the road. I have never hit the gas so hard before in my entire life, like I raced away from that thing like it was a nuclear bomb about to go off. I was burning rubber, man, and as hard and fast as I pushed that old truck, it still didn't feel fast enough. I don't know if it was just a case of some local hunters playing a pretty grisly prank, or if it was something, I don't know, evil. But you can bet your butt I never drove that road on autopilot anymore, because I didn't want to meet whatever cut that poor thing's head off. In January of 1992, Kelly Day Wilson was just a 17-year-old senior at Gilmer High School. With her well-coiffed curly blonde hair and extravagant jewelry choices and bright blue eyes, Kelly Day was a pretty picture and had no problem making friends after she relocated from Natchitoches, Louisiana to Gilmer, Texas so she could live with her mother and stepfather. She hit the ground running and struck up an on-again, off-again relationship with a young man by the name of Chris Denton, and the two spent a great deal of time together in the lead-up to the new year. It seems Kelly's life was going swimmingly well, and it's clear that no one could have possibly expected what fate had in store for her, something that would raise questions among true crime enthusiasts that pervade even today. On January 5th, 1992, Kelly finished her shift at the Gilmer Square outlet of Northeast Texas Video, closing the store at around 8:30 p.m. before heading over to a local bank to deposit the store's daily takings. This particular bank branch's security cameras showed that an individual did indeed make the night deposit for that evening, but the captured footage didn't provide a clear enough image of the person for a positive identification of Kelly, simply showing an arm in her car. We can presume it was her, but we can't be 100% certain. After locking down the store's shutters with their manager, Joe, he wished Kelly good night before driving away in his truck. The last he ever saw of her, she was last seen wearing cut-off stonewashed jeans, a purple rugby shirt with gold trim, and brown loafers, and was getting into her car in preparation for her night drive to the bank. But Kelly didn't arrive home that night, nor did she check in with any of her friends. Her mother became so worried that she sent her stepfather out into the night to aid in the police search that ensued. And like grim providence, it was him that found Kelly's abandoned car in the Northeast Texas Video parking lot at around 5 a.m. The car was sporting a single slash tire, and all of Kelly's personal belongings, including her purse, were inside of her car. Only she and her keys were missing. At first glance, what happened appeared to be a complete mystery, but it was one that local law enforcement was determined to get to the bottom of. For 2 years, the investigation into Kelly's disappearance was headed up by a Sergeant James Brown. One of the first people investigated was obviously Joe, her manager, and the last person to see her alive. However, not only did Joe have multiple alibis, he passed several lie detector tests issued by the police, and as a result, he was rolled out as a suspect. Sergeant Brown oversaw a team consisting of hundreds of police officers and local volunteers, one of which poured thousands of man-hours into an intensive search of the surrounding area. Yet despite such a thorough search, as well as hundreds of tips from the general public, not a single trace of Kelly was ever found. Police believed that they were close when they arrested 17-year-old Michael Bibby, who was taken into custody on misdemeanor charges in an incident of alleged tire slashing. Michael was guilty of many, many things, but as police discovered, slashing Kelly's tires wasn't one of them, and in the end, he too was ruled as a suspect in Kelly's disappearance. Investigators then turned their gaze to another suspect, Kelly's on and off again boyfriend, Chris Denton. The couple were said to have been going through a rough patch at the time of her disappearance, and with people saying that Chris had something of a short temper, there was a period where he became the case's prime suspect. However, through the course of the investigation, circumstantial evidence would clear him of all wrongdoing, and the police would be forced to look elsewhere for their abductor. Unbelievably, in a number of interviews conducted in the process of their investigation, police had heard a handful of stories alluding to a satanic cult that called Gilmer home. But since the accusations named members of law enforcement as members of the cult, specifically Sergeant James Brown himself, the claims weren't taken seriously by those that heard them. Yet, in 1994, the local community was rocked by almost 50 indictments against 10 different people, all on charges of child abuse. And given some of the evidence presented against them, police proceeded with charges of aggravated assault, aggravated kidnapping, and capital murder in connection with Kelly Day Wilson's disappearance. It's at this point that Kelly's story seems to intersect with that of the Kerr family, because in 1990, a man named Wendell Kerr told his wife Loretta that he wanted a divorce, kicking off a chain of events that would bring prosecutors their one best chance at finding the perpetrator. Wendell Kerr was one of 6 adult children of Eugene and Geneva Kerr, a couple who were briefly married in the 1950s before a hastily divorce. Geneva Kerr went on to marry 2 other men, both of whom died before Geneva remarried Eugene, making him both her first and her 4th husband. According to their children, Eugene and Geneva Kerr abused their children on a daily basis. A relative later confirmed their claims of carnal abuse and spoke of witnessing daily incidents of indecent assault. This same relative also confirmed that they'd witnessed Geneva Kerr's interest in satanic practices, including daily readings from the Satanic Bible and an interest in both animal and human sacrifices. In exchange for law enforcement's help escaping the Kerr family, one of their grown-up sons' wives offered to tell investigators everything. She claimed she was kept as a slave to the family for 10 years, couldn't drive a car, constantly threatened by Geneva and Danny, and her only form of identification, her birth certificate, was kept by Danny in his wallet. In her own horrifying words, her role was simply as a breeder. Cut back to Wendell asking his wife for a divorce. Loretta strongly began to suspect that Wendell was trying to ditch her for a younger woman, and if that was the case, she was going to burn his entire life down before she left. She went to the police with accusations, and as a result, Wendell was arrested, placed on the offenders register, and forced to serve out a period of probation. A state welfare worker assigned to the case later concluded that ritualistic, satanic abuse was endemic in all branches of the Kerr family, and over the next several years, almost a dozen of the clan's children were taken into the care of Child Protective Services. The social worker also mentioned in a horrifying affidavit that in October of 1992, 2 of the children took us to show us where the devil meet people to abuse and hurt babies. In 1994, the escaped Kerr wife was interviewed by the Harrison County Jail in Marshall, Texas, in which she described in gruesome detail the torture that Kelly Wilson would receive for approximately 9 days before she was ritually sacrificed and then cannibalized. She described Geneva as the leader and said that several of the Kerr clan, along with Sergeant James Brown, were all present during these events. Connie Martin and Wanda Kerr both had stated in interviews that Kelly Wilson was a birthday present for Geneva Kerr, and that the matriarch reveled in the poor girl's torment. Yet in light of the accusations, it came to light that information was allegedly coerced from the Kerr children, as well as some of those indicted in the disappearance. Some of the children were allegedly programmed to tell the stories the investigators wanted, while the prosecution tried to coerce a confession by offering life in prison in opposition to the death penalty as long as they confessed to the killing, best summarized in the quote from a state official that reads, "Investigators working on little more than hearsay have created a mythology about a satanic cult, leading to what some describe as a modern witch hunt. They indicted a whole family and even a police investigator, destroying his law enforcement career, straining his marriage and prompting death threats. The Texas Attorney General, finding no evidence any of the charges were true, instead uncovered suggestions that the whole cult theory was the product of coercion by overzealous investigators, even to the point that they physically restrained children to elicit allegations of satanic activity. Ultimately, the Attorney General's office were forced to dismiss every single one of the charges alleging satanic abuse and sacrificial murder. The satanic cult was found to be a complete fabrication, nothing more than a fantasy concocted by the Kerr children under the influence of police investigators. Chris Denton, Kelly's old boyfriend, tragically died of cancer in 2004, but there were rumors that he had made a deathbed confession. But close family dismissed these allegations as thoughtless, malicious hearsay and maintain Chris's innocence to this day. Joe Henry, the owner and manager of the Northeast Texas Video and the last person to see Kelly before she vanished, stayed mostly under the radar for a number of years. But in a despicable twist in the story, Joe was arrested on charges of possessing indecent images of children. However, police have emphasized that in spite of the nature of the charges against him, he had never been considered a serious suspect in Kelly's case. For all the twists and turns, trials and confessions, finger-pointing, and numerous suspects, Kelly Wilson has never been found, despite 20 years of searching. She is presumed dead, but a body has never been found and no valid charges have ever been made in connection with the case. Without a body or Audrey's Jeep being recovered, there's simply no way of coming up with any definitive explanation as to why she disappeared. There must be a rational explanation as to why she vanished, but given the circumstances, for all intents and purposes, Audrey and her vehicle basically dropped off the face of the earth, never to be seen again. I feel like I should preface this by making it clear that I'm not one of these paranormal-obsessed, ghost-hunting loons that think there's orbs in all their photos. And when I tell you that one of my favorite TV shows is Penn and Teller's BS, where they debunk all those nonsense conspiracy theories and whatnot, I think you get an idea of what kind of person I am. And for years, I went around thinking that science and logic could account for everything, with the only restrictions being the limits of our own knowledge. That was until something happened to me that I genuinely can't explain, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't come up with any legitimate explanation. The whole thing freaked me out so much that it kicked off a kind of hyperfixation in me that lasted for months on end, to the point that my rational skeptic friends started to think that I was losing my mind. But I haven't lost my mind. It actually happened. And as much as people try to tell me that it was nothing but my mind playing tricks on me, I know what I saw, and it just about put the fear of God into me. We're going back to early spring of 2017 here, the time of the year when it's still getting dark fairly early here in the Northeast. It's around 9 p.m. and I'm driving back to Narragansett from my buddy's place in Newport, when I decide to take a shortcut through Saunderston. It's a drive I'd done like 100 times by that point. I felt like I could do it with my eyes closed at a push. But maybe that's what made me so complacent, a self-assured cockiness that's gotten me into trouble on more than one occasion, because about halfway into the journey, I must have switched off and taken a wrong turn. Next thing I know, I'm having to turn into a residential cul-de-sac to make a complete 180, and I'm so embarrassingly lost that I find myself reaching for my phone to check Google Maps. I check my position, mentally make a note of the turns I have to make to get back onto the highway, then start turning off the street as I put my phone away. When bam, there's a car in front of me. I slam on the brakes, let out a string of curse words, and prepare myself for, at the very best, a few scolding honks of their horn. I then start mouthing apologies at the driver, taking my hands off the wheel and being like, "Dude, I'm so sorry. My fault. My bad." When I noticed something really unusual about the car they're driving. It was a legit classic car. And don't go thinking 70s Camaro or something. This thing was a Buick, like one from the 30s or 40s or something. The kind of car you'd expect to see Al Capone climbing out of in Prohibition-era Chicago. And it was crisp, too. The guy must have sunk some serious cash into that thing because pretty much everything looked brand new. I suddenly realized that while I'm checking this guy's old car out, I'm actually still blocking him in. So I start backing up after giving him a nice car kind of thumbs up after pointing to his hood. The guy doesn't react though. At all. The whole time he's just smiling at me through his windshield. And as I start backing up to let him pass, I remember how he almost looked like one of those old ventriloquist dummies. Something about his hair or how waxy and pale he seemed to just trigger the association. Then, right as I'm about to give him enough space, my car just shuts off. The engine, the battery, everything. I jiggle the keys around, kind of frantically by that point, because I figured I'm making a total idiot of myself in front of the dude with the cool vintage car, but nothing happens. Lights won't turn on, engine won't fire. And my first thought is, God, of all the times for my battery to die, why now? My car was a piece of garbage back then, making it disappointing but not a total surprise. But I'm still blocking in Buick guy, who's surely getting mightily angry after sitting there for a solid few minutes. So I roll my window down, lean out a little, and start yelling over to the guy's car that he has to go around. but he doesn't respond. And all I can hear is this creepy old music coming from his car. I can't see a thing of him because of high headlights. He's not saying a thing, and that freaking song is making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Now this is the part that really freaks me out to recall. As the situation with the guy is turning into something of a standoff, I'm sitting there in the driver's seat wondering why the guy isn't talking, moving, or doing much of anything for that matter. I don't want to honk at the guy. Everything had basically been amicable so far, so I'm just sort of sitting there, waiting, getting more and more anxious as I do so. That's when the lights on my dash start flickering a little, and I think my battery might be coming back on. I don't know much about cars, but I'll take it. So I get all excited thinking I'm going to be getting away from what had been an incredibly awkward situation. I start jiggling my keys in the ignition again, but again, nothing happens. Right until my car radio bursts into life and starts playing the exact same creepy song as the one playing in the other car. It didn't have any lyrics. It was this creepy tritone loop with something playing over it. But somehow it managed to fill me with this feeling of dread as I realized something seriously weird was going on. The whole time I'm basically being blinded by the Buick's headlights while it just sits there. Then suddenly, the thing's headlights cut out, right at the same time my radio does, and I'm plunged into darkness again with my natural night vision having been totally ruined for a few seconds. While I'm half blinded, I try the ignition once again, and I breathe a huge sigh of relief when my car comes back to life again. But that little moment was severely short-lived because, as my own headlights turn on, the old Buick is nowhere to be seen. It came as such a shock that I actually screamed out loud, spinning around in my seat like I might catch a glimpse of it driving away. But no, there's absolutely no sign of that Buick anywhere. It was like it had just straight up vanished into thin air. You think with a big old engine like that, I'd have heard it driving past me, even if I was distracted by other things. And the time between the headlights cutting out and me getting my car running again couldn't be anything over 30 seconds. It would have had to zoom past me to disappear from my view so quickly. Have you ever felt super stoned, and you don't even smoke? That's what it felt like. I'm putting the entire thing on myself, trying to explain it away as like a mini stroke or something, and it even occurred to me that my buddy back in Newport might have dosed me with something groovy, so to speak. But no, sober as a judge the whole time. And you can bet I didn't drink anything because those Rhode Island state troopers just love hunting DUIs. So like I said, because I couldn't find any way to explain what happened, it kicked off something of a hyperfixation in me. I revisited the cul-de-sac where it happened, looked up potential classic car owners in the Narragansett area, and researched medical papers on blackouts and time loss. The latter had me convinced that I was suffering from syncopal attacks, basically when your heart doesn't pump enough oxygen to the brain, a pretty serious condition, so, as you can imagine, I was only too willing to pony up for a medical checkup. Doctor listens to my heartbeat and checks my blood pressure, then, without any further examination, declares there's nothing wrong with my heart. He did say that the blackouts can be caused by stress, but at the time, I wasn't particularly stressed about anything, so I ruled that out as an explanation. One point, I went far out and ended up researching those UFO encounters where people experience time loss, but I figured I'd gone far too down a weird rabbit hole with that one. But as for the thing that people really pick up on with my story for some reason, is the fact that I did actually have a bit of luck when it came to my classic car search. There was a guy out in Middleton who had been trying to sell a 1937 Buick Special for years. The thing was a wreck, but he figured it might catch the eye of some vintage car enthusiasts who'd find the time to fix the old beauty up. I played it off like I was interested in making a purchase and still feel guilty about how excited he got, and he got his nephew to text me over some pictures of the old thing so I could take a good look at it. I'm not saying it was the same model or shape as the one I saw in that cul-de-sac, but I'm not gonna lie, it looked pretty similar. But it's an absolute impossibility that it's the same car, right? A coincidence, if ever there was one. Yet some of the people I talk to about this will always point out the connection and tell me I should have asked where he'd gotten it, if the old thing had been involved in a murder or a hit and run. Truth is, the guy didn't know. He said his dad picked it up at a police auction and died before he could get a chance to fix it up. And obviously, anything he knew about the car was buried with him. I suppose I've rambled on enough about this now, and I've already made my point that I can't explain what happened to me that night without sounding like a complete fruitcake. So, I guess I'll just do what I always do, and leave it up to you guys to decide what it was. But please, don't tell me ghost car or whatever, because I've been hearing that nonsense for like 4 years now, and I'm sick to death of hearing it. And besides, hypothetically, I did believe in ghosts. I think it would mess me up pretty bad to think that I got so close to one, but still drove away, unscathed. At around 9:30 p.m. on the night of August 29th, 2002, 31-year-old Audrey Herron called home to excitedly announce that she'd gotten a raise. Her husband Jeff congratulated her on the good news before Audrey told him she'd soon be finishing her nursing shift at the Columbia Green Long-Term Health Care Facility in Catskill, New York, where Audrey worked part-time. It was fantastic news for the couple, as the extra income would make providing for their 2 children considerably easier. An hour and a half later, at around 11 p.m., Audrey said goodnight to her fellow nurses, headed out into the parking lot to her 1994 Jeep Grand Cherokee, then began the drive back home. She made the same commute to and from work every single day, driving back and forth along State Route 23 in the Jefferson Heights area of Catskill, and that night was no different. One coworker claims that Audrey drove behind her for a few minutes after leaving the office. Given that the weather that night was rainy and foggy, it wasn't long before she lost track of Audrey on the dark, rain-slick roads. The drive from the nursing facility to Audrey's home in Freehold, New York, is about 12 to 15 miles, so 20 minutes driving time at the very most. Audrey's husband expected her home at around 11:25, and he usually stayed up to greet her as she came through the door. But that night, Audrey didn't show. It wasn't entirely unusual for Audrey to have her shift extended at short notice, either to cover another nurse or because a patient required urgent care. So initially, Jeff didn't bat an eyelid at his wife's absence. He didn't even bother to call the hospital to make sure she was actually still there. He just went to bed at his usual time, completely unconcerned. Jeff later recounted that he woke up at around 2 a.m., the morning of August 30th, and noticed that Audrey was still not home. But again, due to the erratic nature of the job, he simply went back to bed assuming that there had been some kind of emergency. The following morning, Jeff awoke at around 6 a.m. to find that Audrey still hadn't returned home. He called the hospital, but was told that she'd left at 11 the previous night. He then called Audrey's mom, Shirley, and asked if she had stayed over at her place. Shirley had only just returned from a Florida vacation with Audrey's daughter from her first marriage, and naturally her mother was excited to be reunited with her, so it seemed only logical that Audrey had driven to her mother's that night. Only she hadn't. Shirley said that not only was Audrey not there, but she hadn't heard from her daughter at all since arriving back in New York State. Only then did it become evident that something was wrong, both Jeff and Shirley become increasingly concerned for Audrey's safety. At 10 a.m., an increasingly desperate Jeff got in touch with Audrey's stepmother, an ex-police officer, who helped him file a missing persons report. However, she also advised him to call around Audrey's friends to check if any of them had seen her. The first 48 hours are crucial in any missing persons investigation, and with any luck, Jeff might be able to locate her before anything untoward occurred. One of Audrey's friends, Karina, recalls getting a voicemail from Jeff at around 1 p.m. that day saying, "Hi, Karina, it's Jeff Herron. We're having trouble locating Audrey. If you've heard from her, please call me. Thank you." Karina has since stated that the first thing that struck her about the voicemail was Jeff's unusual tone. For a man whose wife had been missing for more than 12 hours by that point, Karina claims he sounded remarkably indifferent. You'd expect him to be panicking and anxious, she said, but he just sounded all low and sad, almost resigned. It was only a day into the search and he sounded like he'd given up. Karina had been very vocal that Jeff did not sound concerned in this voicemail, just sad. Karina had wondered why Jeff didn't contact her earlier in the morning before Audrey was reported missing, as she was one of Audrey's best friends, and Audrey had stayed the night with her before. She also wondered why Jeff sounded low-toned and sad on the voicemail instead of panicked and concerned, considering it was less than a day into not being able to locate Audrey. Karina also noted that Jeff could be rather controlling sometimes, and that Audrey had talked of him checking up on her frequently if she went anywhere without him. So, according to her, the fact that he was content to remain in the dark regarding her whereabouts for almost 7 hours is extremely suspicious. On the evening of the day she was reported missing, Audrey's friends got together to walk the route she would have driven home that night, keeping their eyes peeled for any sign of her or her Jeep. Her friends theorized that because it was raining that night, Audrey had taken an alternate route due to the poor weather. But since they knew exactly which short road she would have turned down, they figured that they would find her and her car right away. But not a single sign of Audrey was found along the entire route, almost as if she and her vehicle had simply vanished into thin air. Law enforcement initially speculated that there had simply been some kind of automobile accident, given that Audrey seemed to have disappeared while driving. Officers were told to keep a sharp eye out for a black Grand Cherokee while they conducted a foot search covering a 12-mile radius. Their search penetrated deep into the woods, covering every home, road, and body of water that Audrey's Jeep could have possibly ended up. Even a helicopter was called in at one point to aid in the search. But not a single shred of evidence could be located, something that mystified officers after such an intensive and rigorous search. Although relatively rare in 2002, Audrey had a car phone installed in her Jeep. But then police officers tried pinging the phone's location, and they soon found that the phone had either been disconnected, deliberately switched off, or that it had died. The cops also discovered that Audrey's purse had been left at home, implying she'd forgotten to take it to work with her on the day of her disappearance. This too struck her friends as unusual. Her life was in that purse, and even if she'd forgotten it, she would have probably turned around to retrieve it. It made them suspect that she actually had gotten home that night, and that something had occurred after her arrival at home that has caused her disappearance. Investigators were able to pull only one security camera tape from the area where Audrey was last seen. We only had one grainy video from Cumberland Farms in which it appears that Audrey's vehicle does leave her place of employment and basically turns left, going west on Country Route 23B. That's the last of any kind of technological evidence we had, one senior investigator later reported. We can't confirm it's the vehicle, but it appears to be, because the quality of the video was very poor and very grainy, and it does appear to leave at the time that she would have ended work. In the years since Audrey's disappearance, the police have investigated well over 1,000 leads, but not a single one of them has ever led to an arrest or court conviction. There are a couple of persons of interest, but no direct link to her disappearance, stated investigating detectives. At this point, clearly we suspect foul play. It's clearly a very frustrating case for us because there are no solid leads to follow. In 1998, Audrey and Jeff had had their first child together, a bright-eyed baby girl named Katie. But within a year, rumors flew that Audrey was planning on leaving Jeff, taking Katie with her. Yet many have testified that Jeff did not treat Sanzia very well at all, who was Audrey's daughter from her first marriage. They claimed he had a habit of yelling at Sanzia, although the girl later explained that although Jeff was harsh with her at times, she described herself as a bratty child and felt that Jeff was a good stepfather overall. Jeff and Audrey, shortly after the latter, discovered that she was pregnant with her second child, Quinn, whom she gave birth to in 2000. Soon after this, the couple moved to Freehold, New York, and began building the house of their dreams on a golf course that Jeff's father owned. Life seemed serene for the couple after that, but when Audrey vanished, neither Jeff nor his family actively searched for her, outside of a few phone calls, and they didn't appear too emotionally shook up about it either. Jeff claimed he was perfectly cooperative during the investigation and contributed financially to a private search effort, but these claims are contradicted by several news outlets who argue that not only did he ignore them, but that his monetary donations to Audrey's friend's PI fund were pitiful. They claim that for a man that came from a very wealthy background, his donation of just $1,000 spoke volumes about his family's attitude towards his wife's disappearance. Although Jeff claims his reluctance to mount a serious campaign of public appeals was motivated by his desire to protect his children from the macabre maelstrom of rumors and accusations regarding the death of their mother. A few months after the media circus surrounding Audrey's disappearance had died down, representatives of the Montel Williams show reached out to Jeff to book an appearance. Characteristically, he declined, but Aubrey's circle of close friends jumped at the offer of re-exposing her case to the public. After all, anything that might produce new leads or clues was worth the effort, and they harshly resented Jeff for turning his back on such an opportunity. Then in 2017, Crime Watch Daily attempted to arrange an interview with him at his home. Again, he declined, but the wall of silence had been so prevailing by that point that Jeff's father agreed to participate. In a segment that aired later that year, he told Crime Watch that he firmly believed that his son had no involvement in his wife's disappearance, and that it would have been easy for someone to dispose of the Jeep to erase any evidence of a potential crime. During the same segment, a police investigator revealed that Jeff had partially completed a lie detector test during the initial investigation, but that his father had essentially pulled him out of it under the advice of his attorney. Some have viewed this as highly suspicious, but considering how inaccurate the test can be, and how a faulty reading could be used to gain a false conviction, Jeff's father could well have been right to stop the test. In the light of the fact that Jeff had permitted full police searches of his home on 3 separate occasions, it looks less and less likely that he's anything resembling the guilty party. Audrey's daughter from her first marriage, Sonja, who's not related by blood, has actually been very defensive of Jeff over the years, and is a staunch believer in his innocence. She publicly stated that some of the media portrayals of her stepfather amounted to nothing but hit pieces of hack journalism that tried to sensationalize something deeply personal to her, and for all the wrong reasons. At first glance, there appears to have been no financial motivation for Jeff to disappear his wife. He came from a wealthy golf course-owning family, she had no life insurance, and she didn't have much in the way of savings either. But as you're about to hear, we can't rule out greed as a motivation for her murder. Jeff's father only partly owned the golf course that had made him rich. The other owner is a Russian national, one believed to be involved in serious organized crime, who also lived on the golf course not too far from Jeff and Audrey. Apparently, when police asked Jeff about the possibility of this mysterious Russian being involved in his wife's murder, he mentioned something curious. Audrey had mentioned walking in on an argument between the silent Russian partner, Ron, and a number of other men, who were exchanging harsh words and hushed voices. The men grew silent as soon as they detected her presence, and Audrey left feeling very intimidated. It's also been theorized that the golf course was nothing but a front for the Russian mafia, who in turn leached funds from the business until Jeff's father was in their pocket. If this was the case, Audrey's disappearance could have been meant as a warning to him of what would happen if he didn't pay up. Yet whether the murder was intentional, or Audrey died in the process of being taken, is entirely up for debate, as police have never deemed the theory worthy of investigation. In 2016, a tip came from a woman whose mother had worked at the very same healthcare facility as Audrey. She claimed that her brother had caught sight of Audrey on a handful of occasions while ferrying his mother to and from the hospice, and had developed a dangerous obsession with her. This man had a long history of indecent assault and attempted kidnapping, and he became one of the prime suspects in Audrey's disappearance. New York State Police ended up draining a pond near the man's Catskill home, while corpse-sniffing dogs scoured the nearby countryside. But like countless searches that had taken place before, not a single shred of evidence was found. However, both Shirley and Sonja believe this obsessive individual is to blame, and purport that he could have been hiding in her Jeep before Audrey got in to leave work that day, and because the back doors on her Jeep apparently did not lock, it's then that her abductor struck. Audrey was recorded on CCTV departing her workplace with no unusual indicators, but what happened after she left the parking lot is anyone's guess. In light of such a theory, it's safe to say the police have ruled out the possibility of a car accident and are focusing on the sole possibility of foul play. They've also ruled out the possibility that Audrey simply ran away, given her promotion at work and how much she loved her job. She was also a devoted mother and led an active social life, suggesting that if she did run away, that she'd have informed a friend or taken her kids along with her. Over the years, many tips have come in from all over New York and neighboring states from people claiming to have spotted Audrey alive and well, but as you can imagine, nothing has ever come of any of them. What's frustrating about this case is that the number one suspect is essentially incapable of committing the crime. In order to successfully evade detection, Audrey's killer would have had the resources and time to dispose of a huge automobile and essentially disappear it from the face of the earth. This would have been nigh impossible for one single person to do, unless they had some kind of subterranean body shop at their disposal. But this would suggest a network of motivated, twisted individuals dedicated on abducting and disappearing those unfortunate enough to be caught on the roads at night. And if that really is a possibility, a rational way to explain this disappearance, then maybe none of us are as safe as we'd like to believe. We're supposed to feel safe in our vehicles, machines built with safety belts, airbags, and roll cages, but Audrey's disappearance shows that we're just as vulnerable as our forebears while on dark country roads. And just like back then, predators stalk the highways in search of fresh meat. In April of 2011, 86-year-old Patrick Carnes was living in the biggest little city in the world, Reno, Nevada. Known for its casino and tourism industry, Reno is the county seat and largest city of Washoe County, with a population of just over 200,000 people. Despite being well into his 80s, the World War II veteran was described by those that knew him as being sharp as a tack, who still had a lust for life despite his advanced years. And although he's lost his wife several years earlier, Patrick had adopted a dog named Lucky, who he said kept him accountable and responsible. On April 13th of 2011, Patrick and Lucky were driving back to Reno after a visit to family members living in Toledo, Ohio. Patrick was driving his green Subaru Forester when he approached the town of Wells, Nevada at around 9 at night. As he happened to be approaching a Nevada Highway Patrol officer, he failed to properly switch lanes, resulting in him being pulled over by that very same officer. The cop warned Patrick that what he was doing was dangerous and only agreed to hold back on a ticket when Patrick assured him that he was simply following a truck driver ahead of him. He assured the officer that he wouldn't be driving at night anymore, and the officer's dashcam filmed Lucky wagging his tail in the back, suggesting that there was no tension of confrontation between the two men. The officer later testified that Patrick seemed perfectly composed and sober, giving him no reason to prevent him from driving away. Yet the following morning, just before 6 a.m., Patrick's car was found completely abandoned near a place called Winnemucca, more than 150 miles away. The vehicle was stuck in a nearby sagebush and was facing oncoming traffic, but there was still gas in the tank, and it was still basically drivable. There were no signs of any kind of conflict or struggle, with only a single set of footprints visible in the dirt leading away from the car. What's more, nothing was missing from the car, and it seemed Patrick had walked away from it with nothing but the clothes on his back. One of these abandoned possessions was a map of rest stops on his route back to Reno, the only thing police had to Patrick's planned route. Winnemucca is nowhere near them, so what was it that caused such a radical diversion? And what happened to Patrick's faithful furry friend, Lucky? 3 days later, a witness reported seeing a dog matching Lucky's description near the Pumpernickel exit out near Winnemucca, but a thorough search of the area turned up no signs of the brown Labrador mix. It's interesting to note that 5 years earlier, another abandoned vehicle was found near the Pumpernickel exit, in almost exactly the same spot that Patrick's was found. Judith Casita, a 62-year-old resident of Reno, was last seen driving her 1991 Mazda pickup truck away from her home on Valentine's Day of 2006. Her truck was found just over 2 weeks later on March 5th, abandoned yet still in working order. There is little information available in Judith's case, but it's reported that she had left behind a note stating that she was depressed at her life and her marriage. Although Valentine's Day seems an apt occasion to commit some kind of marriage-related taking of your own life, it seems very coincidental that Judith's car was found at exactly the same spot and in exactly the same condition as Patrick's. While some suggest that the disappearances amount to nothing more than a lost senior and a woman who took her life, others argue that both Judith and Patrick's disappearances are the work of a Nevada serial killer. Although it's not clear why police or journalists might come to such a theory, there are numerous articles outlining missing person cases that originate in the area. One article describes Patrick's case as the latest in a string of missing person cases, citing the disappearances of Rita Christian, who was later found alive, and those of Albert Christian and Grant Model. No matter what you choose to believe, Patrick was officially declared deceased by the state of Nevada in late 2014. But it seems the key to solving his disappearance is connected to many, many others. If we find out what happened to people like Judith, we'll find out what happened to Patrick. Whether or not it's a serial killer or some other more sinister phenomenon, the truth lies in finding their bodies. But the fact that it was only a single set of human footprints, unaccompanied by those of a canine, leads us to believe that something must have been very, very wrong if Patrick chose to abandon his lifelong companion, Lucky. Sure, Patrick was almost 90 years old, and it certainly wouldn't have been difficult for a human being to overpower him. But he was also a combat veteran, and also an all-around tough SOB. The likelihood of him being kidnapped or killed without a fight seems very, very slim indeed. So what stopped him that night? What scared him so badly that he'd abandon his beloved Labrador? These are the questions that might never be answered, and that might just be for the best. Because who knows if we're ready for the truth behind such a vast number of disappearances. I've read an awful lot of spooky night driving stories that involve some kind of dumb urban legend. Guys at the side of the highway with an axe and a fursuit or whatever. Ghostly apparitions that are 3 spoopy 5 me. While I'm quick to call out stories like that, I do have a scary night driving story of my own. And although this one doesn't include anything remotely supernatural, I'm willing to bet it was 100 times more terrifying than anything that does. I'm driving back one Sunday from my mom's place in upstate New York, headed back into Manhattan to get ready for the working week ahead. It had been an exhausting weekend as my family had been celebrating Eid together and I was about ready to pass out by the time it came to drive back into the city. I thought I had everything down. I had my coffee, I cracked my driver's side window, everything they tell you to do when you're driving while tired. But still, one moment I'm driving, concentrating on whatever NPR show was on, and then the next minute, I wake up to pure terror. All I can hear is this deep rumbling, so hard and loud it feels like it's vibrating the entire car, and coming right at me at like 70 miles an hour is the freaking highway guardrail. I slammed my brakes on, heard all kinds of honking behind me, and from what I understand, I only narrowly avoided causing a major pileup. But more than just a pileup. If I'd have sped off the road doing 70 like that, there's absolutely no way I'd be around to write this today. Please, take my advice. Coffee and cool air just isn't enough sometimes. Sleep it off. Don't risk your life. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join a live stream to catch an invite to my Discord. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data. located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, you don't need to poop your pants to have a dirty 30.